guys, welcome back to What If Earth Was in Star Wars. This wasn't my planned thing for this morning, but it looks like what we're gonna do. Anyways, let's get back into it. Where's my volume though?
Hello. Our story continues inside of a vessel. The ship was cruising down to the surface of the planet in the mid-rim territories. The ship rattled back and forth with a sound of clanking on the interior of the vessel. Inside was a girl. She was waiting for the landing procedure to finish so that she could find a Jedi. It was a Jedi that had been hiding out for so long, and after so much time away from the public eye, it could only be a former Jedi who could find her. The girl on the ship waited until they landed on Kashyyyk. The planet was already occupied by the Empire, but this girl who was landing knew that the Jedi she was looking for was here. After all, it was her master. Luna stepped out of the Imperial gunship, surrounded by a number of stormtroopers. Luna told the troopers to be wary. Her master was never good about treatment towards anyone. The troopers moved into the forest cautiously. Luna didn't want to wear her helmet over her head, and so she only wore the elegant Inquisitorius robes that slid across the sand as she moved from the beach into the forest of the planet. Luna knew that her master would likely be living with the Wookiees, though Luna really wanted to know how her half-wit of a master survived the purge. Regardless, she walked forward watching her men fan out into the jungle. Luna closed her eyes and told her men to stop. They turned around and looked at her. She felt through the force, and she could hear the sound of movement. It was a band of Wookiees. Luna told the troops to fire into particular directions that the Wookiees were in, and the stormtroopers opened fire. The jungle was filled with blaster fire as Wookiees fell from several stories up to their deaths on the ground. Luna continued walking forward alongside the numerous stormtroopers as their blaster fire echoed throughout the trees. The sounds of Wookiees calling to each other could be heard, and the Imperial troopers made quick work of these insurgents by planting an E-web into the forest floor and firing away. The 13th sister smiled, watching the Wookiees drop to the ground lifelessly, smoke piling out of their dead carcasses. The Wookiees ran further into the forest. The Imperial troopers looked at the Inquisitor, but she didn't egg them on to go on further. These Wookiees would make fine slaves once they were captured, but for now, the Imperials were not to go further. There was a reasoning for this. Luna planned on luring her former master out of the rebel. So instead of simply marching in after the Wookiees, Luna sent the stormtroopers out around the location, giving the Wookiees plenty of time and room to bundle down for the night and get cozy. When the light in the sky dimmed, the fire inside the trees grew. Luna was going to burn down the entire forest to get these fresh slaves for the Empire, as well as kill her former master. The fires began slow, but with the immense amount of brush in the forest, it caught fire, and the burn grew to a blaze. The Wookiees were surrounded, and they were pushed from their sanctuary. On the only safe side from the fires were a firing squad. They were going to either execute the Wookiees or capture them. It was the Jedi Master's choice after all. Luna stood behind her men, watching from the back as the cries of the Wookiees could be heard. The sound of an older woman calling out orders could also be heard. There were terrible, nightmarish sounds coming from the forest as some of the Wookiees were burned alive. The combined smell of burning wood, brush, and Wookiee flesh was enough to choke a Rancor, but the men stood steadfast, listening to the howls of the immolated Wookiees. The sound of several feet stomping towards the troopers rattled them enough to raise their weapons and turn their flashlights on. It was noticeably dark, aside from the flames that burned around the entire forest. After a few minutes, the lights caught a glimpse of several Wookiee eyes, and the Wookiees were warriors, but they were not fighting back. This was a true show of strength of the Empire. The ability to crush the will of a people was their game, and they mastered it. Luna stepped out from behind her men, calling out to her former master, telling her that if she gave herself up, the Wookiees would be allowed to live. Jarrah couldn't give up that offer. She knew there was a catch, but she had no doubt in her mind that she could very easily beat her former student. The Jedi Master stepped forward and smiled at her former student. Luna grinned as a response, igniting her crimson lightsaber, only using one of the two available blades on the hilt. Her master didn't hold any restraint, rushing forward without saying a word and igniting her own weapon. Jarrah leapt into the air and slammed down onto her student's blade. She was a flashy fighter, and Luna knew that, never letting her master get the best of her. Luna was skilled, having trained against several Inquisitors and even having dealt with Vader once during a training exercise encouraged by the Emperor himself. Luna matched Jarrah's ferocity, matching every beat with a response that even surprised her former teacher. The two of them broke off from the heavy combat. Luna paced around, igniting the second part of her blade, as it cut through some of the brush that sat beneath her boots. Jarrah lifted her blade and pointed at Luna, calling her a disappointment, telling her that everything she was a failure of a Jedi. Jara rushed forward using her anger and rage, and yet they did her no favors. As a Jedi, it ruined her core strength. Luna stepped back, purging every attempt her former master made to kill her. Before Luna was pinned into a corner, she pushed her former teacher around, slamming her into a tree and grinning. Luna told Jara that she wasn't a failure because of her own decisions. She was failed because her master was terrible. Because Jara didn't care for a moment, and now everything that she became was a direct result of Jara's selfishness. Luna turned the blade spin on as the weapon spun closer and closer to Master Jara's knee. Jara tried to defend herself, but her back was against the tree as she cried out in agony as her knee slipped off of her leg and she fell down to the ground. Luna stood over her master and grinned. Using the force to grab her master's blade, she turned around and waved a trooper over, holding it out towards them and then turning her attention back to Jara. Master Kron was wincing as she ached in pain. The strike her former student made was incredibly painful to deal with, and Luna wasn't done. She deignited her weapon and grabbed her master by the throat and brought her up against the tree, slamming Jara's head against the hard wood of the Kashyyyk tree. Luna lifted her former master off of her feet and just stared blankly into Jara's eyes. Luna tightened her grip and watched the light fade from the Jedi's eyes, and then Luna released her former master, watching her fall to the ground. Jara's eyes shot back open, catching a whiff of air again, and she breathed really heavily. She looked back at Luna and thought that maybe it was all deception, but before she could say a word, Luna ignited her lightsaber and slashed down across Jara's chest, killing her instantly. Luna turned around and grabbed her former teacher's lightsaber from the commander and whispered into his ear, "To kill all the Wookiees." The commander lifted his weapon and the sound of blaster fire filled the air, with smoke barreling over the troopers and fire exploding out from the tree line. The sound of Wookiees dying echoed in Luna's ears as she slowly made her way back to the shuttle and got in, lifting up from the surface and being departed back towards the Mustafar system. On Earth, Katooni was a young woman, and she spent the last 8 years with her master Titus, who accepted her as his own and raised her, believing it to be his responsibility to do so. They were situated inside of Messina, and while a lot of the Messina system itself had been left in the rubble by the Separatists, Titus and Katooni found that there were survivors. Pockets of them. The global population wasn't much more than 50,000 people, which might sound like a lot, but it was 50,000, still around out of what was originally 45 to 120 million people. There wasn't a direct record left to articulate the global population before the Separatists arrived. Titus found, through the 8 years on Earth, that the planet had deep roots connected back to the Jedi. While the Separatists had been here and scourged the entire planet, there were few slavers that actually returned the people to their home world, while the rest of them were just simply executed for being too rebellious. The Jedi had been here once or twice in their ancient, remarkable history. The Jedi had been around for 25,000 years, up until this point, and they had secret temples across the galaxy, many of which were known to only a few individuals within the Jedi Order itself. Grandmaster Yoda knew where all of them were, and the Archivists did too, but they were rarely disclosed. This knowledge wasn't held within the archives nor the restricted section. It was passed down from Grandmaster to Grandmaster and Archivist to Archivist. Lothal, Ahch-To, and Earth were among the several planets never disclosed in location. Yoda knew more than anyone else that the Sith were rising, and if the Sith discovered these temples, then they would use them for wrong. The Jedi had a long, concentrated connection with the Ones, incredible beings of the Force. On Lothal, the Jedi Temple had direct routes that led to the world between worlds. The temple on Earth had recently been found by Titus and Katooni, and they were able to access it, being master and apprentice. They had yet to discover the sectors of this temple and really understand what it was. The temple was located inside the same mountain that Master Jara Kron landed on nearly 30 years beforehand. Mount Etna had a small temple on the inside of itself that wound itself up to the top of the mountain and overlooked the greatness of the Mediterranean. It was never noticed by the Sicilians nor the Romans, but Titus was the first of his people to have found it in thousands of years. There were secret societies across the planet that housed these Jedi, though these individuals hid the Force and slowly their religion died out, becoming a speck of dust in the people. As societies formed, they ostracized people who used the Force and considered them magicians, wizards, or demons at the worst. Titus was unaware of this history, but the temple breathed again, and when he and Katooni accessed it, the temple itself gave life to the Jedi once more, freeing up the desolation of the Outer Rim, which was already very terrible. With Crimson Dawn ruling as his own empire out here and not far away from Earth, the Mustafar system, the light was being overshadowed by the darkness. Regardless, Titus spent the most of his days inside of the temple. He studied the hieroglyphics, and he tried to understand what they led to. Similarly to Lothal, the temple in Mount Etna had small, rough depictions of the Ones, these incredible force-wielding individuals, though Titus was having a hard time understanding that. The language was old, and it was the language of the Jedi, the ancient Jedi at that, so it wasn't exactly easy to translate into Galactic Common. Though the key to this temple here on Earth was that it was a beacon. It was for the darkest hours of the Jedi. It was meant to herald in a new era of the Jedi if they fell. Yoda didn't choose Earth because he knew that it was time for someone else to take that mantle, those specific people being Luke and Leia when they were ready. He also assumed that no Jedi would ever get there, being that the odds of either child of Earth surviving to be incredibly rare, and the chances of either of them finding Earth was even more so, let alone any other Jedi finding the planet. But if Titus figured out how to ignite this flame, then it was entirely possible that he would be able to disrupt the balance. It would draw the light and the dark there, being that the galaxy was so dark already. Especially with Mustafar so close, the dark would arrive before the light did, and while Titus was focused on learning the secrets of this temple, he helped the student with everything he could. Katuni grew up incredibly well, and she developed into Form 2. Katuni picked up on Form 2 because it was only one of 2 forms that her master knew well enough to teach. The only reason Titus knew it so well is because he taught it to his sister, and he taught her how to use it. And without having any other means of teaching the other 5 forms of lightsaber combat, Katuni got stuck with Form 2. Though she was fine with it, and she deeply respected her master. He saved her as a young man, and he took care of her and practically raised her. She understood the mistakes he made and never held them against him. She and him were rather perfect as a master and apprentice duo. Titus wasn't the hardest teacher, but he demanded excellence. Though they were in an odd predicament, that they were survivors of a great purge, their trauma still haunted them, and both of them had flashes of the dark side throughout the last 8 years. And as for C-105T, he was the joy of the town. While the 2 Jedi called Messina their home, there wasn't much left of it, and there were certainly no people in this area of the world. They had rebuilt pieces of it, but most of the time they journeyed around using the Razor Crest. It's how Titus and Katuni found out that there were civilizations rebuilding on the planet. Though they avoided interaction, solely because these people of Earth had enough trauma from people from the skies bringing machines of death down upon them. To ensure that the Razor Crest kept flight, they bounced off-world to Utapau, which was just a short jump away to refuel. They didn't want to be stuck here on this planet, and so they ensured that they always had a way off, just in case. Though they avoided going anywhere else because the Empire was large, and it was continuously growing. Earth was unknown, and they wanted it to stay that way. Aside from Katuni's lightsaber training, which was going rather brilliantly, she was becoming very much so like a Jedi who served in the High Council during the Clone Wars. Both Katuni and Adi Gallia were of the same species, and Katuni looked up to Adi Gallia before she was killed by Savage Obrez. Now she had Titus, and he was a bit different of a teacher. He was complex, of course having been affected by Order 66, but he deeply missed his sister. There was an animosity between them, but Titus always felt like he was doing the best he could for his sister. He missed her, and he truly hoped that if she was alive, she was well. If she wasn't, then he hoped that she had a quick and painless death. Arriving in the Mustafar system, Luna's Inquisitor shuttle exited out of hyperspace. She flew down towards a red, fiery planet, located just a little ways away from the moon of Nur, where Fortress Inquisitorius was. Luna flew down to Vader's castle, and when she got through the atmosphere, her lungs closed up. She took a deep breath. She slowly descended at a platform and landed outside of Vader's castle. She got permission to enter the castle, and she walked through the towering structure. On the inside, there were statues and massive pillars. Each step she took felt shorter than the last. The menacing presence of Darth Vader crept over her shoulders, and she stopped to turn around. It was a massive gate. The doors closed behind her. She looked back and saw nothing but darkness, illuminated by a red glare. She started walking again, and her back caved in, and she tilted into a slouch. All the while she was trying to present herself as powerfully as she could. The 13th sister carried on following one of Vader's servants to the castle. Luna tried to look forward. The Sith statues that surrounded her felt like they were looking into her soul. The servant told her to wait where she was, which was situated on a bridge overlooking the planet, until Lord Vader was ready. She nodded her head and took a deeper breath. Sweat began to drip down into her gloves as her body ached. The thought of seeing that mask again terrified her, as is the price of killing a Jedi Master. If a member of the Inquisitorius brought back the lightsaber of a Jedi Master after having killed one, they would have the honor of bestowing it to Lord Vader. This was incredibly rare, and never did it happen, considering not even the Grand Inquisitor was permitted to engage with anything higher than a Jedi Knight. On a side note, most of the Inquisitors were sent in duos to deal with Jedi Knights. Luna looked over the edge. The pit beneath her emitted flames, and when she looked down, she almost fell in. It was a lava river that led to the lava waterfall that crested over the edge of the castle. Luna took a deep breath again, and then she heard the screeching of machinery. It must have been Lord Vader. She wasn't sure. She'd never been to the castle before, but every sound jolted her heart, every echo made her body twitch, everything in the Force felt broken, and that was the simplicity of it. The presence near Vader was broken, and yet the 13th sister knew this feeling. She hadn't yet picked up on it, not the time that Vader beat the Inquisitorius, but she knew this fear. She felt this fear. It's the same fear that the 13th sister shared with the 3rd sister without even knowing she shared it with her. Both of them saw Anakin Skywalker during the raid on the temple. Both Luna and Reva survived. Reva had yet interacted with Vader. Luna waited and the doors shot open. She trembled and turned to the sound of boots echoing. The servant told the 13th sister that Lord Vader would see her. She nodded her head and followed him in. They got to an elevator, and when the doors opened, she looked at a perfectly curated throne room. Everything was evenly placed, and in the middle was a large throne, and on the seat, it was him. Luna's legs began to shake. Her hands rattled with the sound of Jara's lightsaber tapping against her belt repetitively. Luna stepped forward, inching herself towards him. She knew who he was, and she was even more terrified now because she hadn't connected the dots before. Vader saw it. He saw Luna's terrified face the same way he saw her terrified face that night in the temple. Vader wasn't stupid. He could feel it. So, he shot up out of his seat. Luna's eyes widened. She wasn't wearing a mask, and every ounce of fear she had could be seen as a drop of sweat shot down her face. Luna stopped and dropped to her knee as the sweat fell down and launched onto her knee. Vader's boots echoed when he began forward, creeping around the side of his desk, one step after another. Walking around, and finally he stationed himself over her, looking down at her. She told Lord Vader that she killed Jedi Master Jara Kron, and without looking up at him, she handed him the lightsaber. Before she could fully reach up, he ripped it out of her hand with the Force. She immediately twitched her head lower, as if he was about to strike her down. Vader told her to rise, and so she did. When she got to her feet, she was thrown into the air by the Force by Vader. He demanded to know why she believed she could take on a Jedi Master without the permission of the Grand Inquisitor himself or the Emperor. She was terrified. She lost her ability to breathe, and she whimpered, crying out, telling him that she didn't mean to defy orders. She just knew how to find the Jedi Master. She didn't want Jara to escape. Vader listened and slowly lowered her to the ground. As soon as her feet touched the ground, Luna dropped to her knees again, her legs too unstable to keep balance. She looked up at Vader, and he looked down at the lightsaber, and then asked her, even though he already knew the answer, if Jara Kron was her master. She nodded her head and responded with, "Yes, Lord Vader." He looked at her and told her that she had done well. He moved back to his seat and sat down after placing the blade at the edge of his table. Vader looked at her and told her that her rambunctious nature was not appreciated by the Grand Inquisitor. However, her anger and her power were useful allies to the Empire. Vader told her that she had a higher midichlorian count than the Grand Inquisitor himself, but that did not matter. The Grand Inquisitor was focused. He didn't descend into madness looking for revenge against old masters. To be an Inquisitor, the past had to be forgotten, killed off with the light that no longer served the former Jedi. Vader stopped and told her that despite these shortfalls, the ability to defeat a Jedi Master was not something that would not be recognized as the work of a champion. Vader told her that despite her high midichlorian count, it was not concentrated. He continued telling her that a Master of the Force had a concentrated midichlorian count, despite how high or how low it might be. Vader was obviously referring to Kenobi without saying it, because Kenobi too had a lower midichlorian count than Luna. But he was good because he worked hard. The point that Vader got around to is that Luna was useful to the Empire, but she needed to get her head out of her midichlorian count. It may have been high, but a high count did not make her a master. She may have beat a Jedi Master, but she had much to learn. Vader then told her that instead of returning to Nur, she'd be dispatched to Utapau. There had been reports of a possible Jedi Knight. They weren't entirely sure, but it seemed possible. Luna nodded her head and asked which Jedi Knight they thought it was. Vader said the name, Titus, and her heart stopped. She looked up at her master and nodded her head, telling him that it would be done, my lord. In Messina, the sunlight was cresting over the Mediterranean Sea, and Titus was already awake. He and Lugnut were out sitting over the bay. Titus smiled as he suspended upside down, holding himself up with one hand, as the little droid threw rocks at him. Titus balanced himself and avoided the rocks. His eyes were covered with a blindfold, and then the little droid, being a C1 astromech, threw a large rock on the Titus's hand, crushing his fingers and making Titus fall off the wall and slam onto the ground. The droid laughed and spun around like a menace, which he was. Titus pulled the blinds off of his head and looked over at the droid, and grinned. First he was upset, but seeing the pure amusement of the droid got him to smile, and then he turned his head. The glare of the sun blocked his view, but then his student reached out her hand, and her silhouette covered the sun. He smiled as she helped him up, and he asked her if she put Lugnut up to this. Katuni shook her head, so Titus looked at the droid, and the moment Titus turned around, Katuni punched him in the shoulder, telling him that Lugnut wasn't that accurate. She used the force to drop the rock onto his hand. Titus pushed her back, laughing at her, telling her that it was a very clever prank. They'd be training extra hard today. She grinned, calling him an old man before expressing her excitement and her readiness. Titus nodded his head, bemused as he always was when she called him old. The two of them treated each other incredibly well, and without the restrictions of the code surrounding them. They were able to express a more loving relationship that allowed the two of them to be more than just Jedi, but true users of the Force. If anything, their bond was like siblings. They treated each other as such, but it still had a distinct respect of a master and apprentice bond. When they were in training, they acted like siblings, and when they were training, it was master and apprentice, for the most part. The communication between the two of them was terrific. Katuni asked her master what today's training would hold for them. He smiled and told her that they would be going to another place on the planet today. She asked why, to which he told her that he discovered the coordinates of a certain Force-sensitive location on the planet, so they would go there and test it out. She asked what was so hard about doing such a mission as this, which he said that for the most part it didn't work out, so they might as well try and get this one to work for them. She nodded her head, and within minutes they were packed up, with Lugnut and departing for the northwest. After a short flight, they landed in the middle of an open field. They had to be careful. The locals around these parts, especially these parts, were not exactly friendly, and Titus and Katuni did not want to interact with them. They parked the Razor Crest outside of a system of stones. When the Razor Crest doors opened, Lugnut and Katuni raced down the ramp, while Titus turned the ship off and walked out of the vessel. He smiled, watching the little droid and his student. It may have been difficult since the temple fell, but it was a good life. He looked over and saw the birds, and a system of clouds coming in. The three of them got to the massive stone structure. Katuni asked what it was, to which her master pondered. He rubbed his face and told her that they should see if there's inscribing on these stones themselves. She nodded her head as C1 got ahead of them and began to scan the massive stones slammed into the ground. When they got there, they noticed that the stones were empty. Titus told the two of them to fan out. They could maybe find what they were looking for sooner. Titus walked to the center of the structure and looked up. The wind blew through his hair. He thought, Maybe he should, so he knelt down in the middle and closed his eyes. He focused on the Force, and the structure began to vibrate and emanate the power of the Force. Outside of the structure, Katuni and Lugnut looked in. They saw Titus with the Force surrounding him, dirt and grass suspended in the air around him. Katuni's jaw dropped to the ground. She was amazed by her master. The little droid next to her began to beep, and when Katuni turned over to see what Lugnut was on about and being so noisy about, she watched the little droid get cut into pieces. Katuni ignited her lightsaber and looked at an Inquisitor. Luna smiled as she kicked C1 off her lightsaber and tilted her head. She paused for a moment, seeing her brother focus on the Force, and looked back at Katuni, realizing that Titus had adopted an apprentice. Luna paced in front of Katuni, egging her on, by telling her that once she was dead, she would execute her master. Katuni got upset, raging forward and swinging. Luna sidestepped the Jedi Padawan and watched her stumble to the ground. Katuni got back up, telling the 13th sister that her master was more powerful than she could ever become. Luna smiled and stepped forward, slamming down on Katuni's blade, telling the young Jedi that she was much more powerful than her brother. Katuni's eyes widened and she lost concentration. Luna slammed down on the blade 3 more times and used the Force to throw Katuni into the Force wall that was surrounding the stone henge, which ended up recoiling her and flipping her back and slamming her head onto the ground. Katuni got up and her vision was blurry, but she got to her feet and looked at the Inquisitor, all 3 of them. She hit her head really hard, so she was beginning to hallucinate. Luna saw this and took advantage of this, spinning around, knocking Katuni's blade out of her hand, cutting her across the stomach and wrapping her arm around the apprentice's neck. Because of the shockwave, Titus was jolted from his focus on the Force, and he exited through the maze of stones. When he got out, his heart stopped. He looked at his sister. She was okay, but what was she doing? His eyes drifted from Luna to Katuni and then down to Lugnut. Titus leapt forward without igniting his lightsaber and reached out his hand, asking his younger sister what she was doing. Luna smiled at him, while tightening her arm around Katuni's neck. The young Jedi whimpered to her master, telling him that she was scared. She didn't want to die. Titus turned his attention away from his sister and to his student, telling her that everything would be okay. There would be no reason to fear because he would take care of her. He would resolve this, and before he could finish, Luna released her grip and slashed Katuni across the back and kicking her lifeless body to the ground. Titus stopped. His breath caught in the air. He stammered. Inside of his chest, His heart screeched to a halt and a tear slid down his eye. Luna looked back up with a devious grin across her face. She looked at Titus and paced around the dead body. He closed his eyes and his breath returned. His head was spinning, and he caught his breath. He focused, keeping his eyes closed. The sound of the world around him dimmed and the birds were silenced. The rolling and thunderstorm died and the wind disappeared. Titus took one deep breath after another. Luna assumed her brother was opting for the easy way out, just simply saying goodbye without a fighting chance, so she laughed at the possibility of bringing back another Jedi Master to Lord Vader. Did she want favorability with the Emperor? Of course she did. She was going to make herself irreplaceable to the Sith. When she got close, she brought her arm back and swung down. Before she made contact with her brother's skin, a blast of thunder rocked the plains, and a lightsaber ignited to meet it. Luna's eyes shot open, and Titus slowly opened his own eyes. He looked at his sister, seeing every memory he had with her, all the lessons, the stories, the training, the time inside the temple. He remembered every moment his heart ached, wishing that she survived, and now he had to be the one to stop her from following through with her evil decisions. Luna growled, bending the second half of her lightsaber and swinging into action against her brother. Titus backed off, blocking and weaving through every attack she made. Titus made himself room to defend himself, but Luna closed in every little bit of distance he made for himself. Their blades met in the middle. They rang out into a nasty tearing sound as blades screeched at each other. When they broke off, the thunder struck again, and then the rain began to pour down onto the brother and sister. Luna looked at her brother, grinning as she tilted her head like a predator ready to kill. Titus took another deep breath. He'd done this exercise with his sister before, several times, though the only difference is Luna was a grown woman now. She slammed her blade forward, turning on the spin cycle, trying to get Titus the same way she did her master, Jara. But it wouldn't work. Titus tiptoed away from each strike at his legs. He noticed a pattern that she was making, but the pattern changed up as Luna moved from aggression into defense, which threw Titus off of his confident footing. And then his sister took advantage of it, sliding her blade across his shoulders, opening up a wound as he fell to the ground. He retched in pain as she grinned. One more Jedi Master to her collection.
So
First Jara, and now her
brother.
very own brother. As she lifted the blade, she struck down with absolute precision, but Titus used his injured arm to swing his blade up behind his head and block the strike made by Luna. She screamed at him, but he was too quick, kicking her legs out from under her. She fell down and jumped back immediately as he swung down, cutting a hole into the ground where she was. Luna got to her feet and stepped back, allowing the rain pellets to bounce off of her lightsaber. Her brother grabbed his shoulder and put pressure on it, feeling the immense heat beating off of his arm. The same amount of heat left behind by a true lightsaber cut. Titus pulled his hand off and raised his blade, holding it in both of his hands. He was a true Jedi in this moment, embodying every single fear, doubt, and lack of self-worth that he had. He combined it with his courage, his serenity, his knowledge, and his confidence. His sister looked at him with glowing yellow eyes. She was furious. Her power was so much more than her brother's, and she wanted nothing but to beat her brother. She wanted to emerge victorious in this moment. Titus stepped to his left, and his sister moved to her right. The two of them engaged once more, clashing in the middle. She told her brother that she would gut him right next to his apprentice. Titus didn't even give her the satisfaction of a response. She grew angrier, demanding a response from her brother, demanding that he break, and demanding that he show some sort of flaw. He was flawed. She tried to call him weak, calling him a coward, calling him a pitiful excuse of a Jedi. Titus blocked every strike that came accompanied by words of hate, pushing them out of his soul, allowing them to pass by, and allowing himself to embrace the light. The light engulfed his entire being as he pushed his sister back, getting some sort of advantage on her. But before he could truly beat her, she turned on the weapon spin mode and the weapon began to spin incredibly fast at him. He backed off. There was nothing he could feasibly do to defend himself from this onslaught. Luna spun the blade over her head and beat down, slicing through her brother's leg as he fell to his knees. And then, upon instinct, as the dark side flowed through her, she shot lightning at her brother, echoing the sound of the thunder as she did, throwing him across the field. Titus coughed as steam rolled off his back into the rain over him. He looked over at his student and fell to his side. Titus looked down at his leg. It was badly cut, but it wasn't badly enough cut where he wouldn't be able to walk or stand on it, but it was a severe disadvantage. Titus looked at Katuni, and behind her, Lugnut. The rain filled his robes, and he felt heavy. He heard the lightsaber behind him as he turned to see his sister walking towards him again. Titus turned back towards the student and felt his heart. He rose from the ground, slowly getting to his feet. He put all of his weight onto his uninjured foot. As he stood, his sister stopped in her tracks, asking if her brother would die a hero. Titus looked at her, and as he did, he ignited his own lightsaber to the flash of lightning. and with the force he pulled his student's lightsaber, ignited a Tilgar of thunder. Luna tightened her grip around her lightsaber and rushed forward. Her brother steadied his stance, ready to beat her at her own game. As she lunged at him, he spun away from her, slashing her across the back of her shoulder. She screamed out in pain. The echo flooded the fields, and when they turned to each other, the rain picked up as their gazes met thunder, and it boomed again. Titus stepped forward, and his sister did too. The two of them got into range with each other and began exchanging blows with the other. Their duel was fearsome. The sounds of their blades were met by the crescendo of thunder echoing through their ears. Titus slammed down to block Luna, but her swing threw him off balance. She smiled. This was her moment, and her blades began to spin in a cycle once more. Titus saw this, and he threw his blades between the hilt of her blade, and she panicked. Titus ripped both of the blades to the sides, and the Inquisitor weapon shattered. Instead of stopping, Titus did what needed to be done, jabbing one blade through the arm of his sister and slashing down across her torso with the second blade. As his sister dropped, he fell down next to her, both of the lightsabers dropping into the soggy wet ground. Titus leaned over and turned his sister to the side to see if she was still alive. Her deadpan stare told him everything he needed to know, aside from the massive cut across her body. Titus closed her eyes and took in a deep breath. He apologized to her dead body, telling her that he never wanted it to come to this, apologizing for never having looked for her, never being there when she needed him. Luna spent several years in Coruscant's underbelly until she was found by the Inquisitors and pledged herself to them. If only Titus had been there, if only he could be the bigger brother he always believed he was. He apologized for never having seen how badly she was feeling. He then said that while he was sorry, he did forgive her. She was manipulated by the plot, by the evilness that stole the galaxy from the Republic and the same evil that plunged the galaxy into a galactic war. Hours would pass by in the pouring rain. Titus would bury Katuni, Luna, and Lugnut. The rain would continue and Titus would raise his robes over his head and take in every emotion that he was feeling, every raw emotion that he neglected for years inside the temple. He remorsed over the loss of his loved ones. That too included his sister. He forgave her for her actions, the dark deeds she committed against those who fought for peace. He hurt for her hurt, the pain she must have felt all alone for so many years, existing in the coldness and the bitterness of the dark side. The fear that she must have been compelled by, to be able to do such heinous things, and at the end of all of it, it hurt him to his very core. Because he saw it, the flashes of darkness during her training, and yet he chose to ignore it. He believed that it was just a phase, and it costed him his best friend, his student in Katuni. Not only that, Lugnut and Luna herself. His heart hurt for her too. Katuni was too young. Both of them were, only separated by an age gap of 7 years, and they were both gone too soon. And poor Lugnut, too damaged to be repaired. Titus said his goodbyes, removed all the data from the ship, and turned on the autopilot for Luna's Inquisitor shuttle, sending it back to Utapau, with no information of where it came from. Titus, on the other hand, would exit the rainstorm and fall down inside the Razor Crest. His wounds hurt him and he needed Bacta, and his heart needed fulfillment. There had to be some other freedom fighters in the galaxy. If there was a rise of power and they needed strong fighters, then it only made sense for them to employ Force users to fight for them. Titus assumed that there had to be more Jedi out in the galaxy. He didn't know how many were out there, but there had to be. Out of an order of 10,000, there were little more than 100, 2 of them being Grandmaster Yoda and Master Obi-Wan Kenobi. They'd be impossible to find. Of course, Titus only knew about Kenobi's survival, still keeping with him the communications sent to every Jedi after the attack on the temple. Titus, after getting some Bacta inside of himself, wrapped up his wounds with cloth and put his head against the wall of the vessel. He didn't know where the best place to go would be. He lowered his head and saw Katuni's lightsaber sitting on a table, and he took a deep breath. He got up and climbed to the bridge and piloted the ship off the ground. Being that the Razor Crest had an extensive database on coordinates, Titus took the vessel to Triton Spaceport. It was just a little ways away from Utapau, and was located directly on the Rima trade route, which would take him all the way back to the core and even the Inner Rim. Not that Titus wanted to go in either of those directions, but it was an option. When he arrived at Triton, he got a new batch of clothes, something that a smuggler might wear. It wasn't too Jedi associated, and it fit his vibe pretty well. Titus heard about several jobs around the galaxy. He knew that if he worked around, he might be able to get good insight into where the Jedi were. He saw a hiring by a Twi'lek on Triton. It was for a mission on Gorse, so Titus figured he'd take it. When he got to the Twi'lek, he never got a chance to hear her name, but so be it. He was a part of a squad. Most of these guys knew each other, and the Twi'lek was hiring them for a mission. Titus assumed this would be an easy way to get quick cash, and maybe he could find settlement out somewhere in the galaxy. The mission in the Gorse went rather well up until the squad for hire turned on the boss who hired them. Titus didn't carry blasters yet, and he didn't have his lightsaber on him, though he and another man, who was working as a mining transport pilot, intervened. The Twi'lek was a born fighter. She didn't take crap from anyone, especially not this group of ragtag people she hired. During the brawl, the mining pilot helped her beat off the crew she hired, until she flipped Titus over her shoulder and threw him into a wall. The mining pilot told her that the guy that she just hurt didn't turn against her. The Twi'lek asked who the mining pilot was, to which he told her that his name was Kanan Jarrus. The Twi'lek introduced herself as Hera Syndulla. There was an instant bond for the two of them. Hera's droid Chopper, who was also a C-1 astromech droid, beeped some absurdities and zapped one of the men who turned on Hera. Kanan and Hera turned towards the man she flipped over her shoulder. He looked up at her and reached out for her hand. She apologized. She thought he was working against her. Titus shook his head, laughing it off, telling her that he was just trying to help. The little droid rolled up to him and called him something malignant. Hera called out Chopper's name, to which Titus told her it was no biggie. He used to have a C-1, so he was perfectly used to it. Hera turned and thanked Kanan too, locking eyes with him for a solitary moment and then turning back to thank Titus for not turning against her. She told them that she could use some help. She was trying to get a crew together. Hera admitted that she might be a bit bold to take on some random people, but if they wanted to, she could really use them. Kanan and Hera grabbed hands as he told her that he was in. Titus nodded his head, telling the two of them that he would also be joining them. Hera grinned. She looked down at her psychotic astromech as he beeped, and then Hera said that she'd be calling them the Spectres. Kanan repeated it back to her in a question, to which she confidently confirmed it. She called Kanan Spectre 1. She pointed to herself as Spectre 2. Obviously, she was the lead of the group, but 2 was her favorite number. She tapped Chopper on the head and called him Spectre 3. Titus smiled and asked if he was Spectre 4, to which she nodded her head as well. Hera, having finished her job, would tell Kanan to grab his goods and make himself at home in the Ghost. She asked Titus if he had a place. He thought for a moment. His lightsaber and Katuni's lightsaber were inside the Razor Crest. He nodded his head a little shyly. Hera told Titus that if he wanted to, he could call the Ghost home. He was more than welcome to. Titus grinned. Having been in hiding so much, he didn't know if he could truly trust Kanan or Hera. He was willing to try, though. It may have been a bit naive of him to do so, but he trusted the Force, and so he would do it. Titus told Hera and Kanan that he would sell his Razor Crest, and then they could get those credits and use them for whatever they needed. Titus told the other 2 Spectres that he would commit himself to this squad as long as they would too. Hera and Kanan looked at each other and nodded their heads. Chopper rolled over Kanan's foot like the little dastardly devil he was, and he was in too. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is part 7 of our story. Again, special thanks to Gallivant Gaming, Tristan, Darth.
Well, this is the end of this part. It's actually more interesting than I thought. If you enjoyed, subscribe, like, all that good jazz. I'll see you again in the next one.